David Marshall was his name, an Iraqi Jew, brilliant man, brilliant lawyer. And he told the story about a young priest who was actually very devout and wanted to pray all the time, but also had an addiction to smoking. So one day he went to see the bishop and he said, Your Grace, please, may I have your permission to smoke while I pray? So the bishop absolutely threw him out and said, out of the question, this is sacrilegious, and please pray and don't smoke. So he went out, he met a fellow priest, and he looked very dejected. So the fellow priest, I said, what happened? He explained what happened. The fellow priest said, no, there's been a misunderstanding here. Let's go back. So they went back to the bishop, and the fellow priest said, no, Your Grace, this has been a terrible misunderstanding here. All that this man is asking for is permission to pray while he smokes. So the bishop said, how can you deny a man permission to pray? But I begin with that story because it describes so well how you can have exactly the same event and two completely different narratives. And that, in a sense, to summarize my remarks, is the state of our world today. You have one set of facts, but two narratives. And the two narratives, of course, the dominant narrative is, of course, the Western narrative. But the Western narrative, at the end of the day, still represents the views of only 12% of the world's population who live in the West. And then there's a narrative of the rest, which will make up 88% of the world's population. In a sense, this book, The Great Convergence, which I'm happy to announce is on sale over there, tries to capture the world as seen from the eyes of the rest. And what's remarkable is that if you look at the history of the world, especially the past few decades, it was the West that was the custodian of optimism in the world. And the rest basically was far less, optimistic, in many places very pessimistic. And now, in a rather dramatic reversal that we have in the world today, the West is almost becoming a custodian of pessimism, while the rest of the world is becoming more and more optimistic. And so I try to explain why the rest of the world is becoming more and more optimistic. And to explain it, I say that there has been essentially what I call a great convergence, but it's a great convergence on at least three fronts. And I'll try to spend a bit of time on each front and finish at 1:30 so we can have more question and answers this afternoon. And I'm glad my friend Nick Garvin walked in at this moment so he can listen to my 3 points. The first area of convergence is the one that we least anticipated in some ways. And this, of course, is the convergence between the South and the North. Having served as ambassador to the UN, Michael's been there too, I can tell you that when I was at the UN, especially in the 70s and 80s, there was almost a sense of despair that the South would ever make it and be as successful as the North. Today, what seemed impossible is happening on so many fronts. Again, to give you 3 examples on how the South is becoming like the North. Firstly, if you look in the area of global poverty, and as you know, we've been battling global poverty for decades. And when the UN had its famous Millennium Summit in the year 2000, I was there as ambassador to the UN. The UN established something called Millennium Development Goals, MDGs. Now, most of these MDGs will not be met. But one MDG will be met and it will be exceeded by 2015. And what's that MDG? It's the halving of global poverty by 2015. And amazing, we are doing some amazing stuff in that area, so much so that the National Intelligence Council of the United States of America, which by any standards is a relatively conservative body, the NIC has predicted that global poverty will be totally eliminated from the world by 2030. And if this is not the Great Convergence, what is? Right? And I can tell you, when I first started this book tour, this is my 8th stop in 3 weeks. But several weeks ago, when I landed in Washington, D.C. on one Sunday, I turned on the television set, and it was CNN. Farid Zakaria was on GPS, and his guest was Bill Gates. So he asked Bill Gates, how do you feel about the world? And I was delighted with Bill Gates' answer. He said, oh, I'm feeling very optimistic. So Farid asked Bill Gates, why? Why are you so optimistic? He says, very simple. In the work that I'm doing, and he's going out there in the third world trying to help poor people, save babies. He says he's making amazing progress in reducing infant mortality. 1990, 20 million babies were dying a year. 2000, 12 million. Today, 5 million. And he says it's going down rapidly. And I can tell you that it is, when you watch this figure is a leading indicator of our global condition, because babies at the end of the day are the most vulnerable citizens in a society. So when they start dying, the ecosystem around them is not functioning. When they start living, the ecosystem around them is protecting them. So globally, less and less babies are dying, because the ecosystem is improving all over the world and things are getting better, and that too is part of the Great Convergence. Now, on another front, moving from poverty to the middle classes, we are seeing something absolutely remarkable happening in our times. And as you know, traditionally the middle classes, except maybe in the West, make up a very small part of the global population. But we're seeing this dramatic increase in the number of people moving into middle classes all over the world. And to give you just one statistic, and if you have to leave this entire talk with just one statistic, please remember this one statistic. Today, in all of Asia, which has roughly, I think, about 3.5 billion people, the number of people who enjoy middle-class living standards is roughly about 500 million. But by 2020, which is only 7 years from now, right, that number is going to explode from 500 million to 1.75 billion. An increase of 3.5 times in 7 years. Which means that the new Asian middle classes will be 1.5 times the total population of the West. The world has seen nothing like this before. And this is, by the way, part of the great global convergence, as you were saying earlier, because globally the figures are going to go up from 1.8 billion today to 3.2 billion by 2020 and 4.9 billion by 2030. Which means more than half the world's population by then will enjoy middle-class living standards. So this is an amazing transformation in human history that is happening with this, which I call this convergence across the South-North divide. And the other significant area, the third example, comes from a slightly different area, which is in the area of war and peace. And here, as you know, the greatest achievement of the European Union is not really its economic integration, which is, of course, a good thing. But the greatest thing that the European Union has achieved is that you don't just have zero wars between any two European Union member states, you have zero prospect of war. No matter how badly UK and France or UK and Germany may argue, the prospects of them going to war today are zero. Now that's an amazing achievement. Now, in many parts of Asia, I can tell you, we have not clearly achieved zero prospect of war. But we have achieved zero wars. And that's a big leap forward for a region which has seen the biggest wars. And globally, interstate wars have become a sunset industry. In fact, if you look at the statistics, ever since statistics were kept on the number of people dying in interstate wars, around 1950 it was about 500,000 people a year. Now it's down to 30,000 a year, and it's rapidly declining. And by the way, there's a book by a Harvard professor, Steven Pinker, called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which gives you lots of data that explains why this is happening, and also documenting essentially that violence is diminishing in human society too. So this is again is part of the Great Convergence. So you can see what we perceive in the world of the South, the region that we thought were just full of poverty and wars, is now transforming itself dramatically. So that's one dimension of the Great Convergence across between the North and the South. The second dimension of the Great Convergence is between East and West. And I'm not talking about the old East and West, Soviet Union and the West. This is the new East-West, which is West and all of Asia. And I chose that line of division because Samuel Huntington, in his famous book, The Clash of Civilizations, which, as you know, was a bestseller in his time, predicted that in the future of the world, we would see a clash of civilizations, especially a clash between the West and China, and the West and the Islamic world. And the good news is that it's not going to happen. In many ways, across those civilizational divides, they're becoming less and less important. And amazing enough, this is much more true between the West and China. Because even though, in theory, China's political system hasn't changed, it was run by the Chinese Communist Party in 1949, run by the Chinese Communist Party in 1979 when Deng Xiaoping came along, and still run by the Chinese Communist Party. You think, nothing has changed in China. But actually, everything has changed in China, even though the Communist Party is still running it. Because in 1979, when Deng Xiaoping took over and launched his 4 modernizations, at that point, the Chinese citizen could not choose where to live, where to work, where to study, where to travel, what to wear. No choices. When I went to China in 1980, everyone had Maoist suits on, and there were no skyscrapers, no neon signs, So China was completely controlled society. Today, you go to China. If you go to Beijing, if you go to Shanghai, and you walk on the streets, you don't feel that you're in a different civilization. In fact, it seems more like London or Paris when you're walking down the streets. And the Chinese people today can choose where to live, where to work, where to study, what to wear. And amazingly, each year, 70 million Chinese leave China freely. And each year, 70 million Chinese return to China freely. So clearly, in the area of personal freedoms, Chinese society has opened up dramatically. So the gap that was supposed to be between the West and China has clearly been reduced. And I can tell you that, to make a slightly provocative point here, in theory, of course, as you know, the West is closer to Russia. Russia is a democratic society, member of the Council of Europe, and so part of all the same Western fabric. But actually, if you look at the societies, Chinese society, in many ways, the people seem to appreciate much more what the West has done than the Russians do. And this is a rather peculiar thing that's happened. So the society gap is actually less between China and the West than Russia and the West. And that's an indication of how the clash of civilizations will not come. And that's also part of the greater convergence. Now, the harder part to talk about is, of course, the gap between the West and the Islamic world. Because there is clearly a gap, there's a lot of misunderstanding. But I actually believe that even there, things are getting better and better. Because the problem you have is that if you read the Western media, you only get the bad news coming out of the Islamic world. You never get the good news. And yet there is so much good news out there in that world also. Now, for example, you pick up the newspapers, there's a lot of focus on, say, North Africa, right? The problems of Egypt or Libya or Tunisia and so on and so forth, right? And yet, if you add up the total population of North Africa, it is less than the population of Indonesia, which is 250, 260 million. And this country, Indonesia, and I can tell you, if you go back and read the newspapers of 97, 98, they have been confidently predicting that Indonesia will be the new Yugoslavia, that Indonesia, which is the most diverse nation in the region, would fall apart, break apart because of the economic crisis, and, it could never hang together. And lo and behold, Indonesia has a very successful, peaceful transition to democracy, a remarkably successful democratic revolution, and it is hanging together very nicely and growing at 6% a year, comfortably. So there's a lot of good news that doesn't get reported out there. And if you go to many of these places and you talk to the young people and ask them what they aspire to have, the things they aspire to have, the kind of middle class lives they aspire to have are no different from what many in the West aspire to, and that too is part of the Great Convergence that is happening. So the world, amazingly enough, is becoming a better and better place. Now, before I go to my third convergence, let me also emphasize, as someone who worked for 33 years in the Singapore Foreign Service, and Singapore, as you all know, is one of the most hard-headed, tough-minded, realistic governments in the world. So I'm not a woolly-headed idealist. I'm aware of all the problems that exist in the world, and there are 3 full chapters in the book that devote to every single major geopolitical challenge in the world and why we have to handle each one and what the solutions are. So there are lots of problems out there, but I think we have to recognize that for all these problems, several good positive trends are happening in the world. Now, all this brings me to my third and most important convergence, which is, of course, the dramatic transformation of our world in another dimension. Now, to explain this dramatic transformation, I use a very simple metaphor of the boat. And what is this boat metaphor? I say that in the past, when 7 billion people lived in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 193 separate boats with captains and crews to take care of each boat and rules to make sure that the boats didn't collide. And that, I would say, is a reasonably accurate description of the 1945 rules-based order that was created at the end of World War II. But today, the 7 billion people in the world, and sometimes I say both metaphorically and literally, no longer live in 193 separate boats. They live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. The only problem with this boat is that you have captains and crews taking care of each cabin, and no captain or crew taking care of the boat as a whole. And that's a fundamental challenge that the world faces. And if you want proof that we are on the same boat, look at all the major global challenges we're trying to overcome. Look at what happened in 2008, 2009 financial crisis, because you saw at the height of the crisis something quite remarkable happened. And that remarkable thing that happened was that George W. Bush, who by any definition is one of the most unilateralist American presidents of recent times, he was the one who asked for the convening of the first G20 leaders meeting. So even George W. Bush realized that sitting in his cabin on the boat, he couldn't fix the global economy, and that's why he convened the first G20 leaders meeting, and it was a subsequent meeting in London here, chaired by Gordon Brown, that eventually saved the global economy when all the world leaders came out of the cabins, launched a global stimulus package, and that saved the global economy. But the problem with that G20 exercise is that it worked very well when there was a crisis, but once the crisis ended, all the subsequent G20 leaders meetings failed because the leaders went back into the cabins and didn't worry about the boat again. And that's why the world is in trouble. A second example of a global challenge that brings us all together, of course, is the challenge of global warming. And here, it should be fairly obvious to all of us that no one country can solve this problem of global warming. Even if the United States and EU miraculously stopped all their greenhouse gas emissions and went down to zero, China and India and the rest of the world will keep growing, and greenhouse gas emissions will continue. So if you want to find a solution, we all have to come out of our cabins and work together on the bridge of the boat to find a solution to global warming. And the one point I make about global warming, which I think was initially made by the former president of Costa Rica, Jose Maria Figueres, he said, please remember that if you fail to meet this challenge, we don't have plan B because we don't have planet B. We only have planet A. And it's actually quite striking that at a time when the consensus, at least among the scientific community, is that this challenge is real, how little is being done on the part of the world leaders to find a real solution to this. And this is also another reason why I wrote the Great Convergence now, to remind us that we actually have to come together to handle these sorts of challenges. But unfortunately, what's holding us back, and here I'm going to end with a slightly provocative point to show, Michael, I haven't changed that much, is that one of the dirty little secrets that I expose in the book that it has been a Western policy to weaken multilateral institutions over the past few decades. Now, it may have made strategic sense 20, 30 years ago, although in my book I argue that it was never in the Western interest to do that. But it certainly makes no sense for the West to continue weakening multilateral institutions when you're clearly a minority in the global village. And speaking as someone, an ethnic Sindhi Indian living as a minority in Chinese majority Singapore, I know the only thing that protects minorities is to have a rules-based order. And so if it is clearly in Western interest today to promote a greater rules-based order, to work for the strengthening of global multilateral institutions, but the West, because of its old mindset, is continuing on strategic autopilot and continuing to weaken all these institutions like the United Nations and others. And what is actually quite frightening is that I always assume, as a young foreign service officer in Singapore, that the best strategic thinking must obviously come from Western capitals because they have the best minds in government and the best capacity to forecast long-term trends and the best ability to work out the best long-term strategic policies. And therefore, one of the biggest shocks of our time is how the West continues on autopilot on a course which I think will destroy long-term Western strategic interests. And to illustrate that with a concrete example, let me pick an area where I hope everybody would agree we have to work together, which is in the area of pandemics. Because if you live as an affluent minority in our planet, you have the most to lose if there's a major pandemic breaking out. And we know how fast pandemics spread, because if you look at the SARS virus, it began in a small village in China. From China, it went to Hong Kong. From Hong Kong, it went simultaneously to two cities that are exactly on opposite sides of the world, Singapore and Toronto. And what's really fascinating is that Singapore and Toronto are two of the cleanest cities in the world. So it shows that if you stay in your cabin and you scrub your cabin clean, it makes no difference, the pandemic is going to hit you. So you have a vested interest in strengthening any organization that's designed to stop pandemics, and that's, of course, the World Health Organization. And amazingly enough, it has been Western policy to weaken the World Health Organization. You want proof? I review a book written by Kelly Lee, I think she's in London, on the WHO. She points out 20 years ago, 75% of the WHO budget came from regular assessed contributions, which you can use for long-term planning and therefore recruit health inspectors and give them a lifelong career, and 25% came from voluntary contributions 20 years ago. Today, in the WHO, you have almost the exact reverse. 28% comes from regular assessed contributions, and the rest of it comes from voluntary contributions. You cannot build a long-term, healthy organization like a World Health Organization if over 70% of your contributions come on voluntary contributions. That's madness. And amazingly enough, that madness is Western strategic policy. Which is why I think it is time for the West to wake up and realize it cannot go on autopilot. It should therefore switch course and now work with the rest of the world. Thank you.
Kishore, thank you very much indeed.